Hey friends, I am going to tell you today the story of Hagar and her son Ishmael. Some of you may be familiar with this story and some of you may not. It's really connected with the story of Abraham and Sarah, and maybe you've heard of them a little bit more. I'm going to say this is kind of a tough story, and there are some weird things in here and some hard things in here. And so I'm just going to say that it's good to be reminded about some things that are true about the Bible. The Bible is a book that tells us the history of God's people, Israel, and about how God worked with those people. But a lot of the people we read about, a lot of the stories about them and the things they do are not actually good. And so it's not like these people are supposed to be examples to us in their behavior. A lot of their behavior is not good, and yet we see that God still works with people, still helps people. And we often see in the Bible that God is especially helping the people that no one else really cares about and notices. And so that's what I want you to kind of notice in this story. So I'm going to turn my camera around and let you see some pictures on my computer screen, and I'm going to tell you the story while you see these pictures. So in this picture we have Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. So Abraham and Sarah are really old in this picture, and if you remember, God had given Abraham a promise that he would be the father of a great nation, that God would give him so many descendants, so many children and children of children, that they would be as multiple as the stars in the sky. But here Abraham and Sarah were getting older and older and older, and we're having to wait for what God said would happen to come true. And they got tired of waiting. And so instead of being obedient and waiting like God wanted them to, they kind of took control of the situation themselves. And Sarah took a slave that she had, a woman named Hagar from Egypt, and gave her to her husband Abraham so that Hagar could have a baby and give it to Sarah. Now, most of you listening probably know that that's all wrong. Slavery is wrong. It was wrong for Sarah to think that she could just give a human being to another person, that she could take someone else's baby as her own. All of that is completely wrong. And yet we're going to see that God did some things in this story, even though it was not good. So, here is the next slide. So, Hagar had a baby growing in her belly, and Sarah started to despise her or to be resentful towards her. That means that she started to feel really angry and bitter in her heart toward Hagar. Maybe because she was jealous, because Sarah had always wanted to be able to have a baby and just couldn't. And so the Bible tells us that Sarah began to mistreat Hagar. And we don't know if Sarah actually hit her and physically hurt her, or if Sarah just said mean things to her. But the Bible tells us that Sarah mistreated Hagar, and so Hagar ran away. Hagar was from Egypt. That was a different place than where Abraham and Sarah lived. So she probably was trying to run away to go home. This poor woman, things were not going well for her. And think about how she must have felt. She must have felt really just frustrated and upset and alone. But as Hagar was on the road, an angel, a messenger from God, appeared to her. Some people think that it was even God himself in the form of a messenger who came to Hagar and told Hagar some things, gave Hagar some promises. This messenger told Hagar that God was going to take care of the baby that was in her womb, and that his name was going to be Ishmael, and that he was going to be like a wild bronco of a man, that he was going to be strong, a strong fighter, And the messenger told Hagar to go back to Sarah, which again, man, that's kind of hard for us to understand because it seems wrong for God to tell someone to go back to someone who is hurting them. And I don't know really what to say about that because I know that God does not want us to let ourselves be hurt. And if there is someone who is hurting us, we need to get away from them. So this is a part of the story that I have a really hard time with and I don't understand it. But God, I guess, knew that he was going to take care of Hagar. So Hagar listened to that messenger and she said to God, the Bible tells us that Hagar named God and said, "You are the God who sees me." Which, this is a really cool part of the story because Hagar is the first person in the Bible to give a name to God. Definitely the only woman in the Bible to do that. So we see a little glimpse here of how important Hagar is in our story about God in the Bible. So Hagar goes back and she has this baby, Ishmael. And Ishmael grows up as Abraham's son. But then, in kind of a shocking twist to this story, many years later, like maybe 15 years later or something like that, Sarah, who the Bible tells us was very, very old, like 99 years old, had a baby. Really a crazy story. Usually, very old women like that do not have a baby. So Sarah had a baby and named him Isaac. So one day, Ishmael, who is probably a teenager now, was teasing Isaac, kind of making fun of him. We don't know what he did, but we know that's kind of how big brothers tend to act, right? If any of you have a big brother, you know what I'm talking about. They tend to tease their little siblings. And Sarah was very mad about this. Sarah loved her son Isaac, maybe even a bit too much. Maybe she kind of made an idol out of Isaac. And did not like Ishmael teasing Isaac. And she yelled at Abraham about it. She said, "It's your fault. You let me give my slave Hagar to you." And Abraham does not stand up for what is right in this situation. He kind of says, like, "Hey, it's not my fault, and you can do with Hagar and Ishmael whatever you want." So he does not do the right thing in this story. Do you see that Abraham and Sarah are almost kind of the villains of this story? This is not good stuff. So Hagar and Ishmael get sent away by Sarah, and they leave, and they're out in the desert, and they have some water. That's a skin. That's in the ancient times. That's what women would use instead of water bottles, right? They didn't have plastic water bottles, so people would fill up a skin with water, but they were in the desert and that ran out. And Hagar just cried out to God there in the desert. "I'm going to die. My son is going to die. What happened to the promises you made to me?" And then a well appeared in the desert, and they had water to drink so that they wouldn't die. And God's promises to Hagar were renewed. And Hagar named this place as well after God and his faithfulness. And Ishmael grew up to be a strong and healthy man who was an archer, it says. In this picture, that's supposed to be Hagar and Ishmael's wife. So the story ends up okay for them. So that's the end of the story. I'm going to flip the camera back to me now. So I'm curious if any of you have ever heard of that story. And there's a lot in there, again, that's really hard to explain, except to say that even in situations that don't seem like things are the way they should be, we can trust that God is still at work, and that God is definitely watching out for the people who are not being treated well. And so if you look around and you see people who are not being treated well, you can be sure that those are people God is interested in helping and that God has a plan for. And it's just so interesting that in this story we see that God is the God who hears and the God who sees. God hears Hagar when she's crying in the desert. And the first time when Hagar ran away, we hear that she names him, "You are the God who sees." So even if you are going through something sad and hard, you can know that that God sees you and he hears you, and he is not going to let bad things be in charge of your life. God is in charge, and that means that he wants good things to happen, and that he is working to help you even if it's hard to see. So hopefully that helps you understand a little bit about that story that Jesse is talking about in the Spiritual Talk today. All right, bye.